Thank you for joining today's Manufacturing and International Trade Committee of HIA-LI meeting. Today we'll be talking about how to be prepared about reopening your businesses after the pandemic. And we'll be talking about this subject from the legal and insurance point of view. So before we get into the details and before we introduce our panel, let's talk about, in general, about Manufacturing Committee, HIA-LI, and then we'll continue with our panel discussion. My name is Kevin Devecioglu. I am a co-chairman of Manufacturing and International Trade Committee at HIA-LI. I am with my colleague, our co-chairman, Lan Lavlen. So together we basically organize Manufacturing and International Trade Committee meetings, as you know. And our mission is to help manufacturers thrive in Long Island, New York area. And for these, based on this mission, we basically organize educational events, effective tours, and other informational organizations basically we put together for manufacturers, and also some of our events are, as you know, about international trade as part of our committee. We also have a LinkedIn group that's put together. We also invite you to join our LinkedIn group to stay in touch, to share information, and to be basically connected on an ongoing basis. As you may know, we put together different events this year. Before the pandemic, for example, in January, we had a meeting at Microsoft, and we talked about digital transformation of manufacturing in Garden City. In following months, we also met at the Sanation in Ronkonkoma, New York, as you may remember, and we talked about green manufacturing, as in environmentally friendly manufacturing practices. And it was also a great event, both of them actually. It was very educational, and we enjoyed it. So during these webinars, if you can keep your microphone muted, that'd be great, so that we can have a nice and quiet webinar experience all together. I'll also have to do it myself as on my side. And also starting in March, as you may remember, we started to do more and more educational webinars. We started on March 25th, and we talked about actually health and safety management in the face of a pandemic, if you remember. And then from March 25th till the beginning of May, every week we had an educational webinar, as you may remember, and we continue to do organize our education webinars on a monthly basis. I'd like to also remind you that on July 8th, we have a webinar, our committee meeting coming up at 8:30 a.m. We'll be talking about international trade, and the subject is basically how to do business with Vietnam. So we're going to have a panel of speakers, expert speakers, and we'll be discussing about U.S.-Vietnam business relations, and also the trade and what type of opportunities there are for U.S. businesses. So we invite you to register for this event as well when you have a chance. That's available on Eventbrite, so you can register and secure your spot for these educational webinars. Okay, great. So I'd like to invite Tony Joy from HIA-LI. She'll be updating us about HIA-LI news, events, and other important updates. Can also be available. Tony Joy, if you are ready, we'd like to hear from you.
Hi, yes. Hi, Kevin. Thank you so much. And again, I just want to thank, on behalf of the HIA-LI, I'm Tony Joy Candela. I'm the office manager. And I just want to thank both Ron and Kevin. They've been doing some phenomenal programming over the past few months. In particular, giving and providing some critical updates and information and educational resources to our manufacturers for this committee. So you guys have been, again, doing a great job, and that was a great kind of overview that you gave, Kevin, as well, just to, kind of recap the few months. So, so just to give a little bit of an update, again, the HIA has been heavily involved and speaking with the Suffolk County COVID task force, as well as the state and the local government, as far as providing our members critical business updates as it relates to COVID-19 in regards to the phases and everything along those lines. So if you haven't had a chance to, we do have a COVID-19 landing page that you can access directly from our website. And so you'll be able to see, again, a lot of the correspondences that we've been sending out as it relates to these critical updates and the opening of the phases and things along those lines. So certainly please make sure that you check out that if you have a chance to. Also, we have a bunch of our virtual programs coming up, again, that we want to provide and share to our members. So coming up on July 9th, we have a Small Business Task Force Open Forum, Getting Back to Business, Small Business Human Resource Challenges During COVID-19. So we have a wonderful panel. Actually, Ron Loveland is one of the panelists for that program coming up, and we'll just be discussing kind of all the different challenges and new takes on new things coming up as it relates to COVID for the human resource department of your businesses. So that's coming up. We also, on that same day, we've been having our happy hour Thursdays. So it's just a nice opportunity to connect and network with some other HIA-LI members in a very relaxed environment. We say bring a beverage and get ready to kind of connect in a virtual atmosphere. Also on July 10th, we do actually have our Business Achievement Awards coming up, which will be in September, but we do have the deadline for the applications to submit. So if your company has done anything, through COVID that you want to get exposure for, some great, well-deserved publicity, we certainly suggest that you apply and send in the application. Again, it's due on July 10th. And you can nominate your company. It's about a 2-page application, and you certainly reach out to me if you have any questions about it, or if you'd like to apply. I can certainly give you some more information about that. Just a few other programs we have coming up. We have a CEO forum featuring Paul Pachter, the CEO of Long Island Cares. I'm really getting into kind of the head of a CEO and what he's been going through this pandemic and how his company has changed, and that's July 13th. We have a new and prospect member information meeting coming up as well. So if you want to learn a little bit more about the HIA, some benefits, and how to maximize your membership, please join us for that on July 16th. And then we have how will tourism and travel change the new norm? And so we'll be looking at, if you're doing a staycation this year, if you are looking to travel at all in the summer, this is definitely a great opportunity for you to take a look at what those new travel norms are going to look like and how you can best prepare yourself. So we do also have our September 3rd. We will be having our golf outing, which we're very excited about, with some wonderful honorees. And then we have our trade show coming up on October 7th. And that's always a wonderful time for networking and things like that. So, so those are some of our wonderful updates and programs coming on. We also recently connected and partnered with the Suffolk County Department of Labor, and we are helping them with this new initiative where they're looking to reach out to manufacturing companies who want to provide educational information to their workers in regards to how they can stay safe in regards to COVID and things like that. So, just really working on the health and safety of the workers and everybody kind of involved in that. So if that's something that you're interested in, you want to get more information about how you can make that kind of connection, have somebody come in either virtually or in person to speak with your workers, please reach out to me. Again, I'd be happy to help with that as well. So I believe that's all of my updates. So I'll kind of pass it back to Kevin, but thank you all again for joining this afternoon.
Tony Joy, thank you so much for the updates. A lot is going on at HIA-LI, and it's good to be updated. Much appreciated. Thank you. Okay, great. So I think we can start our panel discussion. So what I like to do is, first of all, I like to introduce our panelists, and then we'll talk in detail about how to be prepared, how we can actually prepare to reopen our businesses after the pandemic. So actually today our subject is from the legal and insurance points of view. So we like to focus on these fields, and that's going to be the basic scope of today's conversation. So let me introduce our panelists first of all. So we have two panelists today from industry, legal and insurance industries, two experts and two HIA-LI members, active members, I must say, and they're also very active in our manufacturing and international trade committee as well. We have Rob Tokarski with us. Rob is Vice President of Property and Casualty Group at USI Insurance Services. Rob has 25 years of experience in working with manufacturing and service companies across a wide variety of industries. His background includes leadership roles in senior product management positions at Honeywell, as well as directing global marketing and business development efforts while at Underwriters Laboratories. Now with USI Insurance Services, Rob works to marry the collective issues faced by today's companies with customized business insurance and risk management solutions tailored for his clients. As you may know, USI Insurance Company is one of the largest mid-market business insurance and consulting brokerage in North America. USI offers a one-of-a-kind solutions platform, a real-time, interactive, dynamic, and evolving analytics tool that enables USI associates to customize risk mitigation strategies for clients. Rob, welcome to our panel. Thank you very much for joining. And we also have Will Newman with us, another HIA-LI member and active member of our international and manufacturing committee. Will is a commercial litigation attorney at Baker & Glynn. He represents clients in disputes involving contracts, employment issues, and product liability matters. He also regularly provides strategic advice to companies in advance of disputes, both to avoid the burdens of litigation and to protect their legal claims and defenses of litigation is inevitable. He also contributing editor of the American Bar Association publication, Litigation News, and the author of commercial litigation blog, Unpredictable. And also his company, Baker Glynn, that he's representing, is a full-service law firm that offers top-level legal services. So I'd like to welcome two of our panelists today. They are both, as I mentioned earlier, HIA-LI members, experts in their fields, and we are definitely looking forward to learning from them today in the scope of legal and insurance preparations for us to be ready for the, after the pandemic period. So why don't we do this? What I like to do is I like to let our panelists take over the screen so that we can hear from them, we can learn from them how we can prepare our businesses for the after pandemic time period. What I'm doing is right now I'm making the real presenter so that he can share his screen. I know he has a set of slides that he put together for us. Hello, Will. Okay, we can see your screen.
Cool. Hi, Prasad, and hi, everyone. Thanks so much for being here. I know that there's a lot of applause right now, but you guys are on mute, so I can't hear all of the applause, but I appreciate it anyway.
Thank you.
So today, Rob Tokarski and I are going to talk to you about some things to keep in mind as you're preparing to reopen a business after the pandemic. And again, I don't hope to, over the course of this presentation, tell you that now is the time to reopen. These are just things to bear in mind when you make the decision to reopen your business. And two, my goal is not to teach you guys all of the aspects of law, and I'm sure that Rob can't teach you all of the aspects of insurance that would be applicable to this time. There's not really a lot of precedent, so a lot of this is, this is my first pandemic. But one thing that I'm hoping that we can accomplish over the course of this webinar is to give you guys an idea of the things, the issues that you should be on the lookout for, and give you an idea of the things that you should tell a lawyer or an insurance professional that could be relevant as you decide to reopen your business. Now, one thing that Rob and I had noticed when we were working with Prasad to put together this pandemic is that there are not many other webinars about COVID-19. I had done a Google search for COVID-19 webinars, and if you don't count the 145 million other COVID-19 webinars, no one has anything to say on the subject. And so I understand, first of all, I appreciate you guys being here with us today, but I recognize that you're probably only attending this webinar because there are no other pieces of information about COVID-19 or reopening a business available on the internet. And you're here solely because this is your only resource. But, you know, before talking today, Rob had suggested to me that maybe there's a good reason why, you know, people should be paying attention to webinars like this one. So Rob, let me introduce you here. If you could tell me about why, you know, it's important that people participate in webinars like this one.
Well, thanks to Will and I, there's 145 million and one now webinars.
That's true.
And you know, so it really boils down to the fact that it's an unsettled time out there. Everyone's aware of that. As Will mentioned a little bit earlier, this is our first pandemic, to the size and scope that it is. And people are really thirsting for knowledge, both personally as well as professionally. They want to know what's going on because it's an unsettled world and things are still, there's a lot of fluidity out there. They want to stay informed. They want to stay up to date. They want to have resources and you know, the ability to turn to, I don't want to say people in the know, but either people that are going through some of the same things, or that can provide some insight into some of the things that they're going to be coming up against. So hopefully the takeaway from today is going to be simply, you know, all of you are here for a reason. You know, either that the topic had some interest to you, there was some specific questions. We're going to pause along the way. And if anybody has any questions, you know, by all means, to put them in the chat box. Hopefully we'll be able to answer some of them as they come up, or at the end, if we haven't been able to address it through the presentation itself, we'll be able to answer it at the end, or, you know, you can always reach out to either one of us offline. But that's the big thing, is to serve as a resource. So let's go on to the next slide, Will. Really, the two biggest, I'll say, the guiding questions really about before and after in a reopening, and everyone on this call, you know, we kind of had this, you know, kind of termed as, you know, reopening, you know, your business and some of the considerations, but a lot of you have been doing business already, most likely in a modified form, either working from home or, you know, working different hours, or, you know, maybe your business focus has changed a little bit because of the customer base or the market. So really, you know, we talk about, you know, before and after. Some of these have really kind of come up already because you've already started to focus on it, but you're also probably going to be doing business with individuals that are just starting to open up. So that's the other thing to kind of keep in mind, that is, even if your business has already started to reopen or has been reopened or has been, you know, in existence, your customer base and the people you're going to be interacting with most likely, or quite possibly, if they weren't considered essential, will just start to be opening up in phases now. And really, those two guiding questions to always to be thinking about. One is, especially as a business owner or as a corporate executive, is, am I doing what I believe I'm supposed to be doing as that business owner or a corporate executive? And the second is, you know, if I'm accidentally or negligently, I'm not doing that, and I'm not doing what I'm supposed to, you know, what could be the consequences legally and financially? And you know, and that's, you know, those are the things to kind of keep in mind. And if you think about it, there's a lot of commonality between insurance and legal, and really, it's that both are helping an individual or a company handle risks. You know, so when you think about it, what is insurance? Insurance is simply the transference. It's determining how much risk you want to hold on to, and that's in the form of different policies that you may have, and the premium, the more premium you're paying, and the higher deductible or the lower deductible is the, you know, more, I'll say, more risk that you're going to be, you know, holding on to, and vice versa. That if you want to transfer that risk, that there you'll be paying more of the higher premium, and you'll maybe have a lower deductible because you're transferring that in the form of an insurance company. When you look at it from a legal perspective, again, the legal considerations, if you're not doing the things that you're supposed to be doing, they're helping you handle the risk. The last thing you want to do, and Will's a wonderful individual, but if you're calling Will, especially as a litigator, there's issues that you run into either by negligently not doing the right things, or more likely accidentally. Or I'll put a third category in there, that things are because of the fluidity of the situation, especially related to COVID-19, is that things may have occurred that were outside your control, but now you have these additional risks that are require legal considerations. So with that in mind, let's go to the next slide, Will.
Sure. Before we do, Rob, I want to add an additional thing, and that is that even if you do everything right, people can still sue you, or people can get into a disagreement with you that could end up in a lawsuit if the parties are very adamant about making it a dispute. So I would urge everyone to take the sort of precautions that Rob and I are going to talk about over the course of this presentation. Even if everything you do is right, I think a goal is to make sure that no one will want to have a dispute with you, even if no one ultimately gets harmed or you follow all the laws.
That's a fantastic point. So I would say, obviously employee and customer safety is going to be paramount when the reopening and continued reopening of businesses across the tri-state area. And for a lot of reasons, but at the end of the day, it just makes good business sense on top of all the financial and legal implications that are out there. We talked about 145 million different webinars that are out there on the subjects. There's some things we're going to talk about here, but obviously there's webinars and people that are going to be suggesting best practices about opening, about safety protocols to how to craft them and to put them in place. But kind of the takeaway here is simply, listen, there's a lot of resources on the outside, whether it's a consultant or even internal to your company, whether it's HR or just making sure that there's someone that's kind of been designated to implement and take responsibility for the safety measures and safety protocols. Initiate best practices. Simple things such as if you have a cafeteria within the building, maybe eliminating access or completely keeping that off limits for a while until things I'll say return to a bit more normalcy. There's a lot of companies instituting temperature checks. You go into a dentist, you go into some retail locations, or even when you're going back into the office, daily temperature checks. Mandatory testing and reporting, the social distancing, practicing the social distancing in different ways, whether it's from barriers within spacing desks apart or retail stations apart, to having physical barriers, to one-way walkways through hallways, and then obviously minimizing the number of people on premise. Restaurants nowadays they can have only a certain number of individuals there. Other retail locations, again, limited number or minimum number of individuals that are on premise. If you're your business owner and you have people coming back to work, staggering shifts, continuing the telework and work from home. All those things, obviously, great best practices necessary. Really, I'll say the big takeaway is have a safety protocol in place, have it documented, have it updated, and then just ensure that you are following the safety protocols that you've laid out and you've been updating. And I'll say that both from, not to speak for Will, but obviously from a legal consideration, but also from an insurance perspective, because if and when you need to file a claim, obviously the types of safety protocols and how you follow them and how you've updated or looked at them are going to be questions that are going to be asked. So let's move on to the next.
That's true, Rob. If I could add one other thing, and that is that the cost of additional safety measures or of delaying an opening, may very well be less than the cost of a loss that comes because someone got sick. or the cost of a legal dispute over whether or not the workplace wasn't safe enough. So as much as, when you are opening a business, you may consider each additional day that you're not open, or each additional safety measure is something that comes with a cost. When making the decision about whether to adopt that cost, balance that against the cost of a lawsuit, the cost of a dispute, or even if there's an insurance coverage that applies, the cost of the process and whether or not insurance would cover all of it. So I would definitely consider those costs as well and err on the side of being more safe and, as opposed to taking risks.
Excellent point.
So here, I was going to talk a little bit about some employment issues that companies should consider as the pandemic goes on and as they reopen. One of which is I've seen a lot of businesses have had to downsize their workforce because business just hasn't been coming in and they haven't had the same needs during the pandemic that they did before and anticipate that they will after. One thing that employers should do is, before making any employment decision that affects existing employees, is to look at employment agreements that they have with those employees. And sometimes it's not just an employment agreement. Sometimes there'll be offer letters or an employee handbook, and some courts have interpreted those to be enforceable agreements with employees. And so before affecting anyone's terms of employment, I would have someone at the office look at each of those offer letters, employment agreements, confidentiality agreements, and employee handbooks to make sure that any decision you make about laying someone off, bringing someone back on, any employment decision, changing their hours, doesn't violate an understanding that the company may have entered into years ago when no one was thinking about the pandemic. If you have a collective bargaining agreement, this is another thing to consider as well. Any agreement that you have with employees, especially one that was entered into not thinking about the pandemic, can have implications now. And I have worked with several employers that honestly haven't thought about those implications, and so I encourage you to as well. Another thing to consider are possible discrimination claims. No employer thinks that they act with discriminatory intent. I shouldn't say no, but very few employers think that when they lay someone off or bring someone new on, that they are doing so in a discriminatory way. But employees, and particularly employees' lawyers, look at many decisions through the lens of how can we sue an employer? And if you look through that lens, some decisions that employers make could use some additional thought. So if you have to lay people off, ask yourself, am I disproportionately laying off older employees, disabled employees, women, LGBT people, people of color? If you are, that's not per se illegal, but I would realize that you're doing that and then understand why. Are there documented reasons that if someone were to accuse you of discrimination later on, you can say, these are the reasons why. If the reasons are subjective, so-and-so had a bad attitude, so-and-so wasn't a team player, I'm not saying that that's illegal, but I am saying that if there were to be a lawsuit, it would probably be a tough lawsuit. And it's one where it may make more sense to consider the implications of the termination or the layoff and think hard about whether the legal risk outweighs the cost savings of the layoff. This is another thing to consider is as you're bringing employees back on, if you already furloughed or laid people off or reduced hours, and now you're bringing employees back on, do the exact same calculus. Am I disproportionately bringing back, people who are white or male or young or not disabled? Because if you are, again, that's not necessarily illegal, but ask yourself, is there an employee who does not fit into those groups that may claim that you are acting in a discriminatory way. And if that's the case, then I would make sure that you've got, documentary evidence that justifies why you picked one employee and not the other. Another thing to do is, if you lay people off, to offer them a severance and a release, because otherwise, if you don't, they may turn around and try to get, threaten a lawsuit in order to get some money. I have worked with employers that have not offered releases and severance, or would offer a severance and not a release to their employees that they've had to lay off, and employees turn around and sue them. So I would consider that risk. Another thing you should do for the employees that work in your office is to have written expectations about what the employees will do when they come back. It may seem to a lot of employers and managers that employees are able to work now just like they did before the pandemic. And the truth is that that's not always the case. And there are situations that may not be apparent to management that are apparent to employees. So I would consult with employees before they come back or as they're starting up to see if the expectations you have align with what they believe they can provide. It's better to have those conversations early on or before you reopen than it is afterwards if you have one expectation and they have another, and then a month down the line, someone's unhappy. Have that conversation now. And then after you have it, write down the understanding in an email, in an agreement, something so that there's no misunderstanding about, what you think the employees are able to do now that we're in these different times. Another thing that you should do is to make scheduling and safety accommodations. Let's start with scheduling. There are a lot of employers that have employees with young children or that take care of an elderly family member or a sick person in their home, and they're putting aside the legal consideration. It makes for an unhappy workplace when people are forced to make a choice that's impossible, forced to pick between taking care of their child and doing their job well. If you could work with your employees to find some sort of balance or accommodation, you will, it may be difficult to do that, but the alternative is you have unproductive employees or you have unhappy employees that become unproductive employees. So I think that I'm sorry, then the additional consideration is that there are laws about giving leave to employees that need to take care of family members and other people that need their help, such as the FMLA. And so if you have a situation where there is an employee that needs time or accommodations, I would urge you to work around and even spend money to make those accommodations, because although no one likes incurring costs, those costs would likely be lower than the cost of an FMLA lawsuit or the lost productivity or the cost of replacing the employee if they're forced to quit because of an impossible choice. Also, safety accommodations. Here's a situation where employees, it's better if you find out from them what they are uncomfortable with, because if they don't tell you, there's a chance they will tell OSHA or they will tell the county or they will file a lawsuit. Again, although it's unlikely that an employee may do this, I can't say that it's definitely unlikely, but you may believe it's unlikely. As long as that risk is there, it's better to have these conversations and to make accommodations than to have a lawsuit, because I promise that a lawsuit will be far more expensive than making the accommodation. Some good news though, if you comply with the New York Workers' Compensation Law, you are immune from a lawsuit from your employees if they allege that they got COVID-19 at the workplace, or any workplace injury for that matter, nearly any workplace injury. Of course, the downside is that if you have an employee that incurred an injury on the job, including contracting COVID-19, your workers' compensation insurance premiums would likely go up. So you will end up paying for this, which is part of the reason why Rob had mentioned earlier that you should take as many precautions as is reasonable to minimize the likelihood that someone contracts COVID-19 or otherwise gets injured. But the downside of that would be that you will have higher premiums and not that you will be on the defense in a lawsuit. In addition to the FMLA, which I already mentioned, the law that gave people grants and provided people with additional unemployment insurance and other benefits at the start of the pandemic, the FFCRA, I think it's the Families First COVID Relief Act, also has requirements for giving employees time off if they need it because of the pandemic. And I would encourage employers to look at their obligations under that law, which they may not be aware of because when they learned about HR practices or generally how to run an office, it was before we had this law and this pandemic. And so there may be a need to learn about additional rules that didn't exist before. Lastly, if you have an employee that does contract COVID or a family member of an employee that does or a visitor that does, I would think twice before publicizing that person's name. You know, although certain data privacy laws like HIPAA don't necessarily apply if your workplace is not a hospital or a medical practice, there are other privacy concerns. There are legal liabilities that come from interfering with someone's privacy. And I think that those are things that employers should consider. So, you know, let's say an employee gets COVID and you have to tell the other employees, hey, you've been exposed because someone at work had COVID. I don't think it's necessary all the time to disclose it was Jane Smith that had COVID. Instead, I would, you know, if you have to make a company-wide announcement, say someone at work was exposed. This person worked in this office without disclosing their name. Obviously, it's impossible. You know, at workplaces, people talk. But if it's the official company statement that Jane Smith had COVID, you may be exposing yourself to liability for publicizing that. That's not necessary. Lastly, if your company took any grant programs because, you know, such as the Paycheck Protection Act or any other grant program associated with the pandemic, there may be rules about when you can reopen, how you can reopen, when you can lay people off, and so on. And so I would make sure that you consult with those rules before making any employment decisions. Now, I've been speaking for, I believe it's an hour and a half straight, so I apologize for the long diatribe I've given you all. But before we move on to the next slide, I encourage everyone in the chat to let me know if they have any particular employment questions, and we can answer them during the pandemic. Well, it would be during the pandemic ideally, but during this presentation. So please go into the chat and either type in your employment question, or just to make sure the chat works, type in, I don't have an employment question. And then please, Kursad, if you can let me know about any questions that people pose, and happy to answer them during the presentation.
Absolutely.
As we wait for people to submit questions or the statement that they don't have any, I'll just tell you a bit about this other section, which unfortunately is another Will talking for a bit part. But we'll get to Rob in a moment, Rob fans. So this part of the, so in addition to workplaces having employees, workplaces also have a bunch of other people that could possibly, whose relationships have been affected by the pandemic. If you lease office space, you have a landlord. You likely also have suppliers and vendors, and hopefully you have customers. And so in determining whether the pandemic has affected your relationship with any of these entities, there are a bunch of resources that you should, resources is the wrong word. There are a bunch of things that affect those relationships that you should consider. The first of which is written agreements. So if you rent office space, you have a lease. And if you have customers, you may have agreements with those customers or terms of service with the customers. And if you have vendors, you probably have supplier agreements. Also, if you have investors, there may be agreements with your investors as well. I would have someone review all of these agreements to make sure that there isn't some obligation in those agreements that is frustrated by the pandemic. For example, if there is an agreement that requires an in-person meeting every June 5th or July 5th, obviously it will be difficult to have that meeting now. And I don't think that you should assume that everyone knows that because of the pandemic, the contract doesn't apply anymore. And we'll talk in a moment about what to do about those contractual agreements that are frustrated by the pandemic. But look very carefully at written understandings that were made at a time when the pandemic wasn't happening. That will be difficult now, and then you can work with your landlord or customer or supplier to discuss whether you're going to insist on the performance of that term or whether the parties can find some way to make an accommodation. In addition to written agreements, parties also have oral understandings. If you told the customer on the phone, I'm going to deliver 1,000 widgets this year, just because it's not written down doesn't mean that the customer can't demand that it be provided and that you couldn't, be legally obligated to provide it. So I would do your best to make a list of all of the oral understandings that you have with landlords, vendors, and customers and investors, and see if any of them are affected by the pandemic. Again, you may have the temptation to say, oh yeah, we agreed that this year we would provide $1 million in business, but surely everyone must know that in the pandemic all bets are off. Not the case. Make that list first and then try to either see if that's something that can be performed or that you need to, to perform, or if there can be an accommodation that can be made. And we'll talk in a bit about how to do that. The last three areas of obligations are ones that exist outside of contracts. The law just implies them. One is tort law, and tort law is a fancy way of saying that if someone gets injured, you can sue them for it. That comprises negligence, fraud, breaches of fiduciary duty. Usually, if you feel that someone did something wrong, but there's not a contract you can point to that explains why that person is liable, generally speaking, it would end up in a tort law lawsuit if it were actionable. And so I would ask yourself, if you owe someone a duty, if you are in a position of confidence or provide them services, or if you own or lease premises that people come onto, you owe them obligations like performing your services well, being honest, and being safe. And I would think very hard about the people that expect you to provide safe and honest services. And it may not be obvious. It may be the occasional visitor that comes once in a while. It may be, a customer that you ended up not doing business with that may have expected you to still be honest with them, even though the transaction didn't consummate. It may be your vendors that you don't think is someone as you owe something to because they're the ones that provide you a service. But if they come onto your premises or rely on representations you make to price their services or staff them accordingly, you should consider that and make sure that you're aware of possible liability you would have to them. So before I talk about what to do once you're aware of all of these different obligations that you have that could be affected by the pandemic, I see I'm not allowed to look at the chats here. Kursat, has anyone asked any employment-related questions or told me to be quiet?
At the moment, we have no questions.
Good. Did people affirmatively write, I don't have any employment questions?
Yeah, I see a sentence or two.
Good.
Yes.
Good. I'm glad that people did that. You guys are my favorite people. Okay, so now that you know what the sources of your obligations are, what can you do about them? Let's use an example. Let's say you have leased office space for a factory, but it's unsafe. You cannot operate your factory during the pandemic because it would be unsafe to do so. Or there's no demand for the product you're making, and so it was just economically not feasible for you to run your factory during the pandemic. Your landlord demands rent. What are the things that you can do to make an accommodation? One is you could say that the contract has either a casualty clause or a force majeure clause. There is a ton written on the internet about this, so I'm not saying anything new here. But the short answer is every contract is different, and there's no one-size-fits-all answer to say whether a casualty clause or a force majeure clause means that you don't need to perform under your contract. It applies in some contracts and not others. Also, if you look through your contracts, some contracts have specific descriptions of, there is an exception for a pandemic, or there is an exception if the government orders this type of business to close. So looking to the exact contract language is the first place to look. And if you have a casualty or force majeure clause, that's an area where I would consult with a lawyer just to see if it applies in your situation. If the contract doesn't exactly speak about this situation, I would tell you that it probably makes sense to work something out with your contract party. So to talk to your landlord or to talk to your supplier or customer and say, here's the situation we're in. We can't, give you the rent, or we could, but it would be a huge hardship, or we can't deliver the product. And I'll tell you why. It is so much more expensive to have a lawsuit than it is to just sacrifice a small amount of money now. And on top of that, it's better for the long-term relationship. If you can work out an accommodation with a landlord or with a customer, both parties walk away happier than they would be if they're on opposite ends of a lawsuit. So try to make that sort of accommodation first. Another thing to think about is to figure out if an insurance policy covers the situation you're in. Maybe you can't pay the rent or deliver the goods that the customer wants, but maybe an insurance policy would cover it. This is an area where I think that Rob is better suited to talk about whether that would be the case.
Well, let's use real life right now in terms of, because of what has occurred with COVID-19 and the disruption within the business world, among other things, but in the business world over the last 3 to 3.5 months, you have a lot of businesses that were forced to close either because, as Will mentioned earlier, that they had a customer base that dried up, or wasn't interested or couldn't because of the situation, come to enjoy their product or service. And then you have others where they're operating at maybe not full speed or in a different way. I use this as an example, a restaurant that 95% of the business a restaurant may be taken in is seated, and they had very little takeout. And now they have 10 drivers that are doing takeout, and they have, now, at least on Long Island, you have the ability to have some outdoor seating. So the big thing though, and we'll talk a little bit, I know we're getting a little bit tight on time, but when we talk about insurance policies, again, insurance policies spell out an awful lot of things. People don't like to read the fine print, but there's a reason why a lot of these policies are 50, 60, 70 pages long a lot of times, because they do want to try to cover as much what ifs if possible. And again, that's what you're paying for is a lot of the what ifs. That right now, what we're seeing as an industry and the trend, when we talk about problems, with COVID-19 and claims that are coming in, they're coming in, I'll say, under 3 buckets. One is workers' comp. Workers' comp claims, and a takeaway from that'll be, if there is a workers' comp claim, regardless of whether you believe that it was it had occurred on site or that they had contracted it off site, but they're saying it was on site. Either way, make sure that you're reporting that to OSHA as you would with any accidents that may occur. OSHA reporting is important. Do not pay out of pocket, unless it's something that your carrier has kind of instruct you to do, because a lot of times it'll be at your own cost. So there's things to obviously consult with your carrier broker on. That's the first bucket, workers' comp. The other one, that's more straightforward. The other buckets that kind of fall within is either going to be property, I'll say property policies, and then business interruption, which has gotten a lot of attention within the media and from legislators. There's a couple takeaways on that one. One is that, especially with property, is there a specific clause about viruses, from an environmental perspective? After SARS and some of the other, and I hate to minimize it, more minor pandemics that have been out there or have occurred over the past 20 years, there are businesses that have put in clauses about viruses being covered. In the case of bacteria, it comes on the environmental for property. But remember, the virus has really got to cause a specific damage. And that kind of leads into, was there a trigger? What's the trigger? Simply saying that the business was closed or had to close because of civil authority really isn't a trigger, because there's no damage that was done to the physical property. Now, the business interruption and the business income piece of it is where we have started to see the litigation. This could be another webinar, 8 hours long, if I was to go into all of the different scenarios and things that are kind of being laid out today. Again, as I mentioned, it's a fluid situation and things constantly change. But understanding what your policy does have and doesn't have is one thing. But the other thing is making sure that you're in contact with your insurance professional, the carrier and or the broker that you're using, so that they can guide you through some of this. And I would say make sure that you document all of that. So even if you do decide to go the route of making a claim, know that you're gonna need that documentation. And I would say you're going to need to probably understand that in most cases, the initial claim will be rejected because of the fluidity of the situation. And if it's a gray area, that's kind of the first line of defense. Not to mean or say that they're not going to pay it. And that's why having a good broker is especially essential, is because they can advocate on your behalf and kind of help in laying out the best ways to kind of go about making the claim and then following through on that. So I don't want to go too far down the path here. I could talk offline on it, but understand that from a contractual perspective, insurance policies are contracts. So if it's in there, it'll most likely be covered. If it's not in there, there's not necessarily, and understanding that if it says that I have an environmental piece of this, that bacteria falls within, or in this case, the pandemic falls within an environmental clause or rider that you may have. So I'll leave it at that for now, but understand policies are contracts as well. Maybe we'll go to the next page. We're getting a little tight on time.
That's true. Let me then quickly talk about some of the things that could happen if there's a dispute, and I've touched on some of these before. One is that if you have a contract provision and you think that you're unable to perform it, or the person that you're working with is unable to perform it, if you have a customer that can't pay, or if you have someone that is unable to do what they're supposed to do, I would recommend negotiating instead of going straight to court, because it's so much less expensive. But I would say it's better to do so with a lawyer or with someone that knows the subject matter very well, because that person will know if you're getting a good deal or not. Sometimes people will just make a deal not knowing whether or not they could have gotten a much better one. So that's the best case scenario, is just having someone work something out and then writing, making a contract, amending the previous contract. A lot of people suggest mediation. I am a bit of a dissenting view here, and I oftentimes think that the costs of mediation are not commensurate with the benefits. But I would be remiss if I didn't mention the fact that a lot of people recommend hiring a mediator and having parties talk about how they can find some sort of compromise. But of course, there's costs associated with that. And in my experience, especially people that have deep-seated feelings about whether they're right or wrong, a mediator isn't able to bring people together, in my experience, much more than people can bring themselves. Usually, if people can't agree and one side insists that the other perform and the other doesn't, they'll have a lawsuit. And I can tell you from personal experience that lawsuits are incredibly expensive and are unpredictable. And I urge people not to do them. Even though that's how I pay bills, I still urge people not to. If you're going to hire a lawyer, hire me, but I urge you not to have a litigation at all. And then, of course, the last thing is to look to insurance, and that's what Rob can talk about.
Yeah, and I talked a little bit about it earlier, but from an insurance perspective, policies are in place for, especially from the business perspective, to help mitigate risks. So there's a reason why you have a general liability policy, an umbrella policy, a commercial auto policy. They're specific to risks for that type of undertaking. Errors and omissions. I see on the call we have a pretty good cross section of business owners, company executives, and then service providers and business consultants and others. At the end of the day, that there's whether you are a business owner or you're part of a business, there's insurances that are in place because they help in mitigating those risks. But not all, and if that happens, you file a claim. If something occurs, if there's an occurrence and that you're due some sort of financial compensation to help and mitigate that. That's what you pay an insurance for. But if you're filing a claim, just make sure you document everything, during and then, I'll say before, during, and after, and then just work with the carriers and with your broker to ensure that you have all the information. It's readily available. If it's a business interruption or business income claim, that you can show how much business you lost and why, and the documentation from whether it's contracts not fulfilled or that work that had been put off, to workers' comp, making sure that you get as much background information that's out there when filing a claim in terms of how the employee believes they got it, when they reported it, what you're doing, and what's the safety protocol behind now, going to ensure that there's not further casualties or instances that happen there. So I think we can go on to the next page on that, Will.
Hello, Rob, Will. This is Kevin.
Yep.
We have about 5 minutes to wrap it up before Q&A.
Yeah, that's fine.
Thank you.
Okay, that's great. I'll just take over for this slide, and we got one other slide beside this, but this slide is simply 3 buckets you're looking at for any kind of reopening, whether you're a business yourself reopening or you're going to be doing business with folks that are reopening in different phases. One is about managing physical distance. The second is about employees and visitors to your location. And the third is the location itself, the physical workspace. And so all 3 of those, there's webinars out there, there's information that can be shared. But the bottom line is that best practice is always kind of breaking it into those 3. Regardless of which 3 you fall within, make sure you're documenting everything as part of safety protocols. All right, next one, Will.
Sure. To add what Rob said, go ahead, Rob.
No, I was just going to say that with this last one, just because I want to make sure that we have any time for questions, I would simply say that don't anticipate that this is the end. That we're in the recovery stage, and hopefully we are. But I would say this is a wake-up call to a lot of businesses. So making sure that you understand that this could, or absolutely in the future, something like this will happen. Maybe it won't be a pandemic, but something that will impact your business and your livelihood. There's things to consider for future shutdowns, whether it's because of pandemic or because of other factors that are global in nature. So you got to be prepared for that, and you can prepare for that through insurance, through I'll let Will take the last 45 seconds on that. But
no, I bet you're absolutely right. And one thing that people should bear in mind is that how people conduct themselves in this pandemic will likely be a precedent for future shutdowns. So every decision you make, think about what the implications are, you know, setting a precedent in the future. If you lay off a bunch of people now, then, you know, when you do it in the future, people will look to see, did you do it differently in the future than you did it now? If you honor a contract now, then maybe in the future, you know, people will expect you to honor your contract. So bear that in mind. Thank you guys so much for listening to us. Obviously there's a lot to talk about on the subject, so I appreciate all of your guys' patience and not, you know, setting your laptops on fire.
Thank you very much, Rob. It's been very educational, much appreciated. So I took over the screen before we go to our Q&A session, and they're very important. I mean, every single slide that you share with us, actually, they were all educational and very helpful for all of us. Much appreciated. Now we'd like to open up the Q&A session. So if you have any questions, you can share with our panelists right now. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to unmute everyone. So if you'd like to share your questions verbally, that's perfectly fine. You can also type in the chat box, whichever is easy for you. I also have received some questions as well. So one of the questions in the meantime, I can share with our panelists, if I may. So one of the questions is for Will. Is there such thing as a pandemic clause in closing in contracts? Is this something new, or is it part of force majeure and casualties, you will say?
So the short answer is those clauses exist. They're not very common, but I've seen them. Oftentimes there's clauses that describe things that are like pandemics. So I've seen leases that say that, you know, if there is a health emergency that prevents the office from operating, or if the government has shut down the office for a health-related reason, those are clauses that would apply in a pandemic. But generally speaking, if something is a force majeure or not, that depends on a lot of the circumstances, and that usually ends up in a lawsuit if the parties can't agree.
Thank you, Will. By the way, to our attendees, we keep our contact information on the screen. So there are many things to talk about. Just like Rob mentioned, we can talk about it for hours because many things to cover and go into details. Since we have limited time today, they just summarize it in their slides. So if you'd like to continue this conversation, if you have questions, you have our contact information on the screen. Feel free to contact us after this meeting as well. Moving on to other questions. So based on your observation, what mistakes do you see people making as they reopen? I think this question for both of our panelists, I will say.
I'll take it first, Will. So from an insurance perspective, you know, a couple of things. One, we've seen folks assuming they're not going to, if it's not in my policy, that I'm not going to get paid. So there's a lot of assumptions. It's not in my policy, so I'm not covered. Or I see that there's a business interruption piece of my policy, so I am going to be covered as based on this. So the assumptions based on the realities is probably one of the biggest mistakes we see. And then the second thing that we see is not having all of your ducks in a row, so to speak, when proceeding with filing a claim or for having conversations with insurance carriers, etc. Is not having had documented or having your story all together and consistent and moving forward to be able to take it to the next level. And then there's the delays and the frustrations. So those are the two from the insurance perspective.
The major mistakes that I've seen have largely been about employment law, and that has been not having conversations with employees to see what they're concerned about. And then if you're laying people off or bringing people back on, employers should have releases and severance to make sure that there's no unanticipated lawsuits. And they should really think hard to make sure that they are not acting in a way that someone could consider to be discriminatory. No one likes being accused of discrimination, and a little bit of thought ahead of time will save you a huge headache afterwards.
Thank you very much. I have been receiving questions about the recording of today's meeting. Yes, I will be sharing the recording with you. I'll send all of our attendees. And if our panelists say okay, I can also share the presentation slides. So I'll ask our panelists if they say okay. I'll also send you the email. But definitely I'll be sending you the recording of today's meeting. Next question. If someone gets COVID-19, what are the immediate first things a business owner should do?
Rob, you want to take this one?
Yeah, why don't you start with this one? Well, and then I'll chime in.
Oh, sure. So I would say the very first thing you should do is to isolate the risk and make sure that no one else gets COVID-19. If that means shutting down the office, contact tracing, do whatever you can to contain the exposure of liability and notify people that someone has been exposed. That is, I think, the very first thing to do. And then the next thing to do is to make sure that you have limited your liability to that person and to anyone else around them. So, offer to make sure that their medical expenses are covered, or to make sure that no one is upset with you and will try to hold you legally liable. And I don't want to say that the reason you should do this is to limit your liability, although that's a big part of it. It's also the right thing to do at a time where everyone has a lot of anxiety and is looking to support each other.
And then from the insurance perspective, I would say the biggest thing is, regardless of whether you believe that the employee had contracted it or the individual had contracted it on the workplace, is reporting it to OSHA. OSHA is very specific in terms of reporting guidelines. But the second thing I would say is the next call right after OSHA should be to whatever insurance carrier you have that's with the workers' compensation. So that's make sure that they're aware of it, even if it's not going to be something that winds up getting filed under workers' compensation. You got to make sure OSHA is aware of it, and then make sure your insurance carrier is aware of it, and then start filling in and providing that detailed information on, the things such as where the employee, how they believe they contracted it, how it maps directly back to the workplace activities, et cetera, and really work through and have that documentation available. Not to say everything is going to go under or does go under workers' comp, but at the same time, you want to be prepared to have all of that information available.
Thank you for the answers. I appreciate it. Well, one of the things actually, Rob, you mentioned about the risk management. I think that is very, very important for companies. We know it's important, but I think until we seen the COVID-19 crisis, wasn't really for companies to pay. They weren't paying that much of attention, I believe. So with the risk management, it looks like we can prepare ourselves for what may come. Simply, so that is very very critical. So we in our manufacturing committee meetings, we keep talking about risk management. Risk management from the point of process risk management, IT risk management, environment risk management. So all these things actually we can sit down as a group in our company, think about possible risks, think about possible contingency plans if that happens. So that is very important. So definitely lesson learned from this presentation as to risk management is very important for everybody, for all of our businesses, all of us, and to be prepared in a way to prepare in plan A, plan B. I mean, we haven't seen something like COVID-19 recently, but we have seen SARS. We have seen other diseases all around, in the world basically. We've seen Ebola, for example, but this is really too much affect all of us basically. So that's lesson learned for us as to risk management. Also recently, we have been also getting questions and trying to get ideas in our manufacturing committees about performance management. So most of us right now working remotely, working from home, going to office on certain days. So performance management is actually becoming a challenge for many companies. Now it's difficult to see our team members, our colleagues. So how you're going to basically set the goals, how you're going to manage the performance of our team members. So that is also another challenge nowadays as we see it. Will mentioned some part of it as to have written expectations in place. So it basically verbalize and document what are the expectations from the team member, and that may be also helpful as to measure the performance, I believe. But this is still a open subject for us to cover in, I think, coming meetings. I have another question that I'd like to share with you, if that's okay. How much money is it worth to avoid a lawsuit over COVID-19 issues? I think that's for you.
Krishan, that's a tough question to answer. In my experience, a general rule of thumb is that the least expensive lawsuit could cost you between $50,000 and $100,000. And so if there is a dispute where you are totally right, the other side is totally wrong, it is often the case that it would still be worth giving someone like $20,000 or $30,000 than having a lawsuit with them. I know that sounds pretty jarring, but litigation can be unpredictable and go in a lot of directions. And so that is why I would say that if you're in the $50,000 to $100,000 range, it may be worth it to not have a lawsuit and to spend that much money.
Okay. Yes, that's something important tip. I appreciate
a lot of
it.
money.
Thank you for understanding. A lot of money. That's for sure. That's for sure. Thank you so much for the tip. Much appreciated. That's also a good question and great answer. Thank you so much. Well, I think we address all the questions. I am also checking the chat box. I don't see any other questions. So as I mentioned earlier to our attendees, we have our contact information on the screen. If you'd like to continue this conversation, if you have questions, you can send us an email, definitely. So I think we are coming to the end of our webinar. So final thoughts, final remarks, basically. So we have been inviting experts to our committee meetings since, I will say, March, and we have been learning a lot today. Also, we learned a lot. That's very important. So one of the takeaway is basically the risk management is very important for us. So we need to think about our risks. We need to prepare ourselves. Also, performance management is another challenge nowadays, as we see it. Both of our panelists actually address important things. Also, the contracts and written understanding of the agreement is very important. That's also something that we learn again today, which is very important and keeping in mind. Also, something that we have been getting questions about in our committees, how to manage performance when we are working remotely. So that this is very important for us to use digital tools available for us as businesses, basically. Right now, it's difficult to go to office. It's difficult to meet with our team members. So using digital tools as much as possible, digitizing the business processes as much as possible. And we'll have a separate session on this as well, how to manage business processes remotely in the face of a pandemic. We'll address these in coming committee meetings as well. Rob, Will, would you like to share your final thoughts before we end the meeting? Let's start with Rob.
So just my final thoughts is, listen, we're all, I really hate the phrase, but it's true. We're all in this together. Again, if you have any questions, I'm sure Will feels the same way. We're all members of HIA. We're all members of the local business community as a whole. If you have any questions, listen, you don't have to worry about not having done or do business with myself or with Will, or that the question may seem either rudimentary or very specific. If you have any questions, ask us. We're part of different committees within HIA. We've been part of HIA for a while. And I think, as we started off with, is that people are really, there's 145 million, COVID-19 hits out there that are when you Google, and it's because people are looking for information. It's a fluidity of the situation. So why wouldn't you align yourself with someone who's been immersed in certain areas that can kind of help you? both from a business perspective, both from and then also a networking perspective. So I'll leave it at that. Will, maybe you might have some thoughts as well.
Yeah, same thing. I think that if there's one takeaway that people take from this presentation, it's that there's a lot of different factors to consider, because it's always better that you keep people safe than to need an insurance claim or have a lawsuit. So just be mindful of all these things, and if there's ever any doubt or questions, reach out and ask. I'm just happy, and so is Rob, to answer questions as they come up. It's a way that we can be helpful, so please feel free to reach out.
Rob and Will, thank you so much for your time. Thank you for a very educational presentation that you shared with us. It's always a pleasure. You are very active in HIA-LI community, also in our committee as well, and it's been a pleasure. And it was actually very educational, as I mentioned. So thank you so much for sharing your insights and your expertise. Much appreciated. I'd like to also thank our attendees for joining today's meeting. Very educational meeting today. I hope you also learned as much as I did, and we'll be still learning. There are many things we don't know about COVID-19, and things are actually very fluid, keep changing. So we need to be in touch. We need to learn from experts, and we'll keep bringing you different new educational, informative committee meetings. So having said that, I'd like to also invite you to our next meeting on July 8th. We'll be meeting at 8:30 a.m. in the morning, and we'll be talking about how to do business with Vietnam. We have experts coming in, and we'll be talking about U.S.-Vietnam trades, opportunities between two countries, how to do business, customs as to do business in Vietnam or buying from Vietnam or to sell to Vietnam. So it's going to be very educational. As you know, part of our committee is about international trade. So we'll be addressing the market of Vietnam, and more to come in the scope of international trade as well in coming months. I'd like to thank you for your time, and thank you for your interest. Much appreciated. Looking forward to seeing you in our coming Manufacturing and International Trade Committee of HIA-LI meetings. Thank you, and have a nice day. Stay safe.
Great. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks, everybody. Thanks, Prasad.
Thank you. Have a nice day. Thanks.